Välkommen alla sammen! Cool video today about the Norse concept of the soul. Now there are many aspects to the soul in the Norse beliefs and the self, as are all pagan religions pretty much, but in the Norse beliefs there are 8. But we're speaking today about the Hugr. The Hugr seems to be the most relevant and also the part of the soul that's kind of most similar to our traditional kind of monotheistic view of what a soul is, and it's also the one with the most functions, that humans can actually use their practices, magic or other spiritual rituals to project this Hugr. So in this video I'm talking about what the sources say from both the mythology and the later on folk tales, and I'm speaking about how the books that you all know and love, Poetic and Prose Edda, might have a very wrong idea of it. So here we go. The Hugr in the pagan original mythology seems to be actually quite different from the Hugr on later on Scandinavian folk belief. And by the way, I say Hugr because that's the Norwegian way to say it. Swedish or Danish say it a bit differently, but they all mean the same thing in the folk tradition. So in the folk tradition, the Hugr is basically the soul, but definitely not the Christian understanding of the soul. Even though Scandinavia was officially Christian for hundreds of years by that time, the pagan understanding of the Hugr, on the other hand, simply means thought. You all know this as one of Odin's ravens, Hugin, but let's speak about it. So first we'll speak about the pagan mythology. Now the Hugr in the pagan mythology is simply related to our thoughts, that's all. That's how it's translated, at least. Also, it's a part of our soul and our self, which our thoughts are, but it's just the part that is responsible for thinking and intelligence. So the most famous attestations of this in the mythology are Hugin and Munin, Odin's ravens, and they are translated to mean thought and memory. So in the Poetic Edda poem Grimnismal, where Odin is describing Valhalla, he speaks about Hugin and Munin, and he says how his thoughts and his memory fly away every day. He fears that his thoughts will not come back, but the real fear is that his memory will not come back. We also see in the Prose Edda, Gylfangning section, it says how Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, fly out all over the world and return to him in the evening and tell Odin what they see and hear. Heimskringla, Ynglinga Saga, says pretty much the same thing, but remember in Heimskringla, Odin was not a god, but a real man who was good with magic. He was called a wizard or Gothi or Vitki or sorcerer or something like that in the stories. So I can go into Hugin and Munin for 2 hours, but I'll do a separate video on that. Next, another example of Hugr in the Norse mythology is Hugr, which is the small little figure that Thor's servant Thialfi went in a race against when they were in the land of the giants. So Thialfi loses the race to Hugr 3 times. Thialfi was supposed to be the fastest kid in the world, and he still lost, and it wasn't until later that they found out that Hugr was just the personification of thoughts. So nobody can run faster than thoughts, right? So that's the moral of that story. Then Hugr is also attested in the Poetic Edda poem Völuspá, and that's the Hugr-Stari, the dwarf, which just means the stubborn one, translated. But that seems to be something unrelated, but who knows, maybe there's some connection. But that's about it for the Hugr in the pagan mythology. So, in my humble opinion, I think Hugr being translated just as thoughts is just a piss-poor translation and understanding of the word and pagan spirituality. This is what I talk about. Some of these people translating these Old Norse texts have PhDs in linguistics, but they have absolutely no understanding of pagan religion from around the world, not even in Scandinavia either, some of them. Every translator of these texts in the past 200 years have been like this. Most of them. But I'm going to tell you why I think this in a minute, but you'll see kind of what I mean when we speak about the concept of Hugr in the folk tradition. Now this is, we have records of it starting in the 1500s. So in the folk tradition, the Hugr was seen as the soul, but again, there are many parts to the soul. The Hugr specifically is one that could enter and exit the body in birth and death, but also many times in life too. So very simple. Your Hugr can leave the body when you die. We have countless folk tales about that, stories of a person's Hugr coming out of their body and going to inform a family member that they have died and to bid them farewell. The Hugr in the folk tradition can also be an omen of death. If a person is about to die, if you have maybe a sick grandmother in the bed and you see her Hugr or walking around the farm, that Hugr has left the body. The life and other aspects of the soul have not left quite yet, so the person's still alive, but they're going to die some days later usually. Another belief in the folk tradition is that some people have a stronger Hugr than others, and the strongest Hugr was called ridende Hugr, so the riding Hugr, and this was actually said to leave the body even when the person was awake during the day, and the Hugr would ride livestock and make the animals sick in those folk tales. The most common tales, though, that we hear about the Hugr is when a Finnish or Sami person they come in and they lay down under a blanket or sometimes a jacket and they go into a trance. Sometimes they sleep, sometimes they lay still, and sometimes they shake or tremble, but every time they instruct the others around, do not lift the blanket or wake them up under any circumstances. And they do this to send their Hugr away. There's one tale about a Norwegian fisher where they do this ritual, and then the Finnish person returns with the captain's wife's spoon just to show what she's cooking for dinner. Retrieving spoons is actually something we see quite a lot in these tales of sending the Hugr out. You could also send out your Hugr and take over an animal, as Finn once did, to go check how his co-worker's wife was doing and see if she had given birth all healthy. These stories are almost identical to the ones in the much older Norse sagas, where the Sami or Finn does the exact same thing, and these are sagas about pagan times. See my video on shapeshifting for lots of examples on that. But we also do see many tales about sending your Hugr away while you sleep, and you can take over an animal and move around. So whenever you sleep, your Hugr leaves the body. That's everybody, all of you. Most people, their Hugr just stays around the area, maybe in your bedroom or around your house, but other people with a stronger Hugr and ones that have a little bit of training, they can actually send it away on very long journeys according to the folk tales. But you know, the further they are away, the longer it takes to get back, which is why they were instructed to never wake the person who was sleeping. And then finally, your Hugr could be taken over in your own body. One tale was about a Finn who was a werewolf. He was a regular man, but he showed his neighbor in the next farm over how the wolf skin worked. And he pulled it up over his arm so he could see how his arm turned into a wolf's right there. The neighbor asked him to put the whole wolf skin on. I want to see, put it over your head. And the Finn says, no, I can't do that. Then I will become a full wolf, and the wolf will even take over my Hugr. This is what berserkers are. Again, watch my video on shapeshifting. I speak about lots of examples of that. So there are many more stories like this and lots more in the book Scandinavian Folk Belief and Legend. The book comprised of records and tales from very remote villages in Scandinavia the past 500-600 years. So it's an awesome book. I recommend it. Very often, these folk tales that we hear are almost identical to the sagas from pagan times. But they don't call it those sagas, they don't call it sending the Hugr on a journey like they do in folktale times. That's because the sagas we read about this were usually written by Christian priests in the medieval ages, and they would not have understood pagan spirituality about the Hugr or shapeshifting or anything like that. People in the folk tradition, however, they really would have. A person living in the remote mountains of Norway in the 1600s, they would have a better understanding of pagan spirituality than a Christian writing a saga in the 1200s. It's because many pagan ideas and traditions were still alive in these remote villages in Scandinavia, really up until 100 years ago sometimes. So folk tales that we hear, you know, they often have a better reflection of paganism than much older sagas and mythological texts even. So definitely folk tales are not to be ignored just because they appear to be from Christian times. So what happened here? Hugr simply meant thoughts in pagan times, or so it seems. And hundreds of years later, Hugr meant something like our concept of the soul, but it's not like the monotheistic view of the soul. These are Christian times in the folk tradition, but the stories we hear about the Hugr are sure as hell not Christian. No, the Hugr in the folk tradition is actually identical to how other pagan tribal people around the world view the soul. Of course, they all call it different things, but it's the same idea of their soul being able to come in and out of their body. For example, Aboriginals in Australia used to believe that there was a little body inside of our own that was controlling us while we live, to the point that they could even tell you the weight of it. And, you know, when our bodies die, the little body inside us lived on, and this is the soul. In India, they have and still do believe this, I think, that the soul exits the body when it dies, and also when a person yawns sometimes. So they snap their fingers at someone yawning just to put their soul back in, scare the soul back into their mouth. They believe that the soul can escape through the mouth or any other holes in the body. The Intonama tribe of South America also believe this, so they plug up all holes when someone dies, so their soul does not escape and carry someone else's soul away before the funeral. The tribes of the Aru Islands have a almost identical belief, and those people would not sleep in the house when a person died there because that soul would potentially take away yours while you were asleep. And if it doesn't return to your body when you wake up, you will soon die too. In the tribes of Oceania especially, they used to have laws that you were not supposed to wake a person who was sleeping because their soul might be very far away. And if you wake someone, it has to be slowly and gradually. So for those of you who like to hit the snooze button on the alarm clock in the morning like me, that probably means your Hugr is pretty strong and travels quite far when you are asleep. We also see this belief in German folk tradition, where they thought a little bird or mouse would escape through the mouth while sleeping, and that was the soul, and it was dangerous to prevent those things to come back into the body so the person could wake up. In Africa too, there are certain tribes who actually have a wizard who set up traps, and they capture souls as they leave people during the sleep. And then the wizard basically holds the soul ransom until the person wakes up and pays. Then, of course, we hear lots of tales from around the world about sending your soul out of your body and taking over an animal. Skinwalkers in the Native American tradition are a famous example of this, but we find cultures all over the world believing in this, and even records of thousands of years ago. We have Greek and Roman records that believe the same types of things like that. So these are just a few. I'm not going to go into anymore. It's going to take too long. You can read a lot more in a book called The Golden Bough. But there you see, the Scandinavian folk understanding of the Hugr is exactly the same as many other tribal pagan people around the world, living with their most ancient natural animist beliefs that we in Europe too would have had thousands of years ago, long before the Viking Age, but we had similar beliefs at one point to all these tribal peoples. This is why I believe that the Hugr in the mythology is poorly translated as thought, and it's because you don't go from the Hugr being viewed like a soul that can leave in and out of the body in ancient times, ancient animist beliefs, into the Viking Age, the Hugr simply meaning thoughts. And then a few hundred years later, the Hugr is viewed the exact same way as it was in ancient tribal animist times. That doesn't make any sense. That would be like riding a horse for thousands and thousands of years, stables, taking care of the horses, everything, and then throwing all that away because you started to ride donkeys for 300 years, like in the Viking Age, and then you say, oh, let's ride horses again here. It doesn't make any sense. So that's why I think the Hugr as the soul that can travel in and out of the body, it has always been there. It has always been there from the understanding of animist times in Scandinavia, all over Europe, to the Viking Age and to the folk tradition. Really up until about 200 years ago we hear stories about this. And as for the short 200 to 300 year period in the Viking Age, Hugr has just been translated badly. I don't want to say incorrectly, because Hugr in Old Norse definitely means thoughts, but it definitely doesn't have full understanding of the word, and I think that has been a bad translation in pretty much every source that I've seen about this. Just look at all the sources where the Hugr is translated as thought from the mythology, right? If we interchange that for a soul that can leave in and out of the body, it fits perfectly in every attestation. Think about Grimnismal, where Odin he's either dead or in trance, and he's describing Valhalla like he sees it. Like your Hugr and your memories are flying around, and your Hugr will come back to you, but you are worried a lot more that your memories won't. So this is a myth about when we are dead and waiting to be reincarnated. Our soul will move on, but the memories are not going to come back to us, unfortunately. Next, in the Prose Edda, also in Ynglinga Saga, Odin's Hugr and his memories fly out into the world and tell Odin what they see. And remember, in Ynglinga Saga, Odin was a real human sorcerer in those sources. So this is also identical to the tales we hear about sorcerers, wizards sending their Hugr out to discover some news or do some work or give someone a message. From the folk tales and from all over the world, really. We also have many stories about how a sorcerer, when they are asleep in this state, you are not supposed to wake him up under any circumstances, because then his memories may never come back. He may get sick or even dead. The Norse sagas have things about that, and like I said, tales similar all around the world. Finally, in the Prose Edda, the race between Thjalfi and Hugr, and it's translated as thoughts. Thoughts that are even faster than the fastest boy in the world, but really our Hugr is faster. That's what that translation should be. It's when you send the Hugr out of the body, it travels faster than even the fastest person can run in the world. And remember, the Hugr is described in the Prose Edda in this story as a small little person, just like it's believed to be in other places in the world. So it really does make more sense in all of the mythological attestations that the Hugr is translated incorrectly as thoughts, and it fits better that it could be the common folk tradition of the Hugr that can leave in and out of your body. Like I said, Hugr definitely does mean thoughts in some contexts of Old Norse, but I think it's more complicated than this basic translation, and it has a dual meaning. Possibly too, originally our Hugr, our soul, is very connected to the thoughts. It makes sense, but I don't know. Those are just my thoughts and the sources. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Vi ses nästa gång.